She had spent most of her life in the background, quietly moving through the world without attracting attention. Her days were filled with ordinary tasks, small responsibilities, and routines that left little room for recognition. The piano, however, had always been her refuge. Its keys were her closest friends, the place where she could pour out her feelings without words. She had learned to play in secret, practicing late at night while the rest of the house slept, letting her fingers dance across the keys in solitude. Music was her language, and in those quiet hours, she spoke freely, only to herself. That evening, the hall was full of polished marble and glittering lights. Expensive carpets covered the floors and chandeliers hung from the ceiling, scattering light in every direction. The air smelled faintly of perfume, fine wine, and polished wood. Guests moved gracefully, their laughter light but carefully measured, like rehearsed notes in an invisible script. She was not a guest. She was part of the staff, walking through the hall, carrying trays, ensuring that the event ran smoothly. She moved quietly, careful to avoid drawing attention. She was invisible, blending into the background just as she preferred. Then it happened. A careless joke made without thought suddenly turned toward her. One of the guests, a wealthy man who seemed to hold the room in his hand with just a glance, mentioned the piano. "I wonder if anyone here can really play," he said, with a laugh that cut through the polite murmur. His eyes, sharp and curious, flicked to her, and she froze. She felt herself being pushed forward, almost against her will. Staff were moving behind her, gently guiding her toward the grand piano at the center of the room. Her heart started to pound. She had never been forced to perform in front of strangers before, especially not in a place like this. She could feel every eye in the room turning toward her. The polished shoes and expensive dresses becoming a single wave of expectation. A quiet panic settled in her chest. She wanted to say no. She wanted to step back and disappear into the shadows, where she belonged. But the pressure was too great. One of the staff whispered, urging her forward. There was no escape now. She took a slow breath and sat down at the piano. The polished wood reflected the lights above, the keys shining under her hands. The millionaire's eyes were fixed on her, curious, skeptical, and perhaps a little amused. The guests were waiting, some with polite interest, others with barely concealed judgment. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, a tangible force that seemed to tug at her very soul. She tried to steady her shaking hands, her fingers hovering over the keys. Unsure if she could even play in this moment, memories of her years of practice flashed through her mind. The countless nights she had spent alone, learning, failing, trying again. The music had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could be herself without fear. But now, with every eye watching, it felt like a test she could never pass. She could hear the faint murmur of conversation around her, the low hum of judgment, and she felt exposed in a way she had never felt before. Her stomach twisted, her pulse quickened, and a small voice inside her whispered that she should run. Yet even in that moment of fear, something stirred within her. A quiet determination, almost invisible at first, began to grow. She remembered why she had learned to play in the first place, not for praise, not for applause, but because it was her truth. The piano had always been her voice, and perhaps, just perhaps, it could speak for her now. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the memory of familiar melodies wash over her, grounding her in the one place she felt safe, the music itself. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the room in a new light. The faces that had seemed judgmental were now just faces, people who did not know her story. The polished shoes, the glittering jewelry, the expensive clothes, they did not matter here. All that mattered was the piano, the keys under her fingers, and the music that waited to be released. She took another deep breath and let her fingers rest gently on the keys, ready to begin. The first note sounded soft and uncertain, almost hesitant, but it was enough to shift the room slightly. Conversations quieted and heads turned. People began to notice without realizing why that something different was happening. The music was not loud or showy. It did not demand attention. Instead, it spoke quietly, carrying emotion and honesty with each note. She felt her own fear begin to melt, replaced by a cautious confidence. The piano was no longer a test. It was a friend sitting beside her, helping her find her voice in this unfamiliar place. As she played, she began to notice small changes in the room. The laughter and whispers faded into a respectful silence. Guests leaned forward slightly, curious and engaged, drawn into the music without knowing how. Even the millionaire's expression shifted, his sharp eyes softening as he listened. He had expected perhaps a polite performance, a few simple notes played for amusement. But what he heard now was something different, something honest, vulnerable, and real. Her fingers moved more freely now, guided by years of practice and the deep connection she felt with the music. She had learned to play in the quiet when no one was watching. And now that same practice was guiding her, giving her courage she did not know she possessed. Each note was a small victory over her fear, a statement that she could be seen and still remain true to herself. She could feel the music flowing through her, filling the room with something intangible yet powerful. The audience remained silent, captivated, though they did not yet understand why. Some faces showed surprise, others a hint of admiration, and a few betrayed the beginnings of genuine emotion. She could sense the tension in the room slowly dissolving, replaced by a quiet curiosity, an openness that had not been there before. It was as if the music itself was reshaping the space, creating a new atmosphere where judgment and expectation no longer had power. Despite the growing confidence, she remained humble. She did not play to impress, to seek praise, or to change anyone's opinion. She played because it was the only way she could express herself honestly in that moment. Every note carried a piece of her story, every chord a fragment of her experience. And the audience, whether they realized it or not, was becoming part of that story. She felt the connection stretching across the room, an invisible thread linking her to the people who had seemed so distant just moments before. As the first piece came to an end, she allowed herself a brief glance around the room. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. People were listening, waiting for the next note, the next phrase, as if they had forgotten the world outside the music. She felt a spark of hope, a tiny, fragile hope that she could make it through this moment, that she could be herself and still be heard. The piano had become more than just an instrument. It was her shield, her voice, and her bridge to the world that had once seemed so intimidating, even as she prepared for the next piece. She knew that this moment would stay with her forever. The fear she had felt walking toward the piano, the tension in her body, the uncertainty of being seen, all of it was transforming into something new. She was no longer just a background figure, no longer invisible. She was present, and she was alive in a way she had never experienced before. The room had changed already, even if only slightly, because she had dared to be herself. With another deep breath, she let her fingers hover over the keys once more. The first notes of the new piece emerged, soft at first, but growing with each passing moment. She felt the music wrapping around her, carrying her forward, giving her courage and strength. The room responded silently at first, then more visibly. Eyes followed her hands, expressions softened, and the polished, formal atmosphere began to feel warmer, more human. She realized that she had the power to shape this moment. Not with words or gestures, but with something deeper and truer, the music inside her. For the first time that evening, she felt a sense of control. She could not change everything, but she could shape this experience, transform the tension into connection, and speak her truth without fear. Every note was a statement. She belonged here. Not as a servant or an object of curiosity, but as a person with talent, emotion, and a story to tell. And in that moment, the hall grand, glittering, and intimidating felt like a place where she could finally be herself. Even if only for a little while, the room had shifted imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. What had begun as an uncomfortable, almost humiliating situation was now evolving into something remarkable. People were listening, really listening, and she could feel it. The music was no longer just sound. It was a bridge between her and the audience, a silent conversation that did not require words. She had entered the room as an observer, a background figure, and yet she was becoming the center of attention, not through force or showmanship, but through honesty and courage. As the last notes of the first piece faded, she allowed herself a small smile. It was private, quiet, almost invisible, but it carried a weight she could feel. She had made it through the first step. The room had changed, even if only slightly, and she had begun to change herself. The piano, her old companion, had guided her, giving her the strength to face the unknown and find her voice. And she knew that, whatever came next, she was ready to play, to share, and to transform the space with the music that had always been hers alone. The moment after the first notes faded felt heavier than silence itself. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room watching her, waiting for what would come next. Some of the guests whispered to each other, but their voices were hushed, unsure. She could see the millionaire leaning slightly forward, his expression hard to read. There was curiosity in his eyes, yes, but also doubt. It was as if he wanted to see if the first notes had been a fluke, a lucky accident, or if she really had the skill to hold the room's attention. She sat still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. Gathering her courage, her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly, and she could feel the heat of the room pressing down on her. She had never played in front of so many people at once, and certainly never under such judgment. The pressure was intense, almost suffocating. And for a moment she considered stopping, turning away, and retreating to the shadows where she felt safe. But something inside her would not let her. The piano had been her refuge, her secret world, and now it was the only thing she had to hold on to. She reminded herself of every late night spent practicing, every hour of quiet dedication, every small triumph that had led her here. That memory became a lifeline. The room was full of subtle tension. The guests were shifting in their seats, their polite smiles stretched thin by anticipation. Some were curious, others impatient. A few whispered quietly, skeptical of her ability. She could feel it, the unspoken assumptions about who she was and what she could do. They saw a quiet staff member, someone they believed was invisible. They wondered how she could possibly match the elegance and skill of performers they had seen before. She understood why they doubted her. She had doubted herself many times, but she also knew that doubt did not define her. Her talent, her years of practice, her connection to the music, these were what mattered now. She took a deep breath and let her fingers rest gently on the keys. The first few notes of the new piece emerged slowly, soft and careful, as if testing the water before diving in. The sound was pure, honest, and unexpectedly delicate. She felt the familiar comfort of the piano under her hands, the way it responded to her touch, as if it understood her fear and was willing to guide her. The notes seemed to breathe along with her, each one carrying a little of her hesitation and a little of her growing confidence. Slowly, she began to relax. The music started to take on shape, forming patterns she had played countless times in private, but never with an audience. The sound filled the room, subtle at first, but enough to make people stop and listen. The whispers faded, replaced by attentive silence. She could feel the room beginning to shift, though she could not see exactly how. Faces softened, postures straightened, and a quiet curiosity began to replace the doubt in their eyes. She felt it like a current running through the hall, lifting her confidence and quieting the fear that had held her frozen just moments ago. The millionaire's eyes never left her, and she could sense him analyzing every movement, every note. It would have been intimidating if she had let it be, but instead, she focused on the music. She let herself sink into it, letting each note carry emotion she could not put into words. She thought of the nights she had spent alone at the piano, feeling every chord with intensity, practicing not for anyone else, but because it was who she was. Now, that same practice gave her a sense of control. The room was large, the audience intimidating, yet she felt grounded. Tethered to the keys and the music she had loved for so long, she began to notice subtle reactions from the audience. A woman near the front shifted in her seat, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, eyes wide with surprise. A man at the back leaned slightly forward, his skepticism replaced by curiosity, almost admiration. Even the millionaire's expression softened imperceptibly. The first notes had captured attention, but the music that followed was starting to move them. She was not performing for applause or praise. She was telling her story, and the audience was beginning to listen. The piano responded to her every thought, if it anticipated her emotions before she could express them. She allowed the music to guide her, to take the weight off her shoulders and transform it into something that could connect with others. Her hands moved with increasing confidence, no longer trembling with fear but flowing with purpose. Every note carried her story. Years of quiet practice, nights spent alone. The hope that her music could matter to someone, even in a world that seemed indifferent. Time seemed to slow. She lost track of the seconds as the music enveloped her, filling the room with a presence that went beyond words. The audience was drawn in, silently acknowledging the skill and emotion behind every note. The tension that had weighed so heavily on her began to dissipate. She could feel a subtle shift, a softening in the room's atmosphere. Where there had been doubt and judgment, there was now attention and engagement. People were listening not just with their ears, but with their hearts, as she continued to play. Small details began to emerge in the audience's reactions. A guest covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes glistening, moved unexpectedly by the music. A man resting his chin on his hands leaned forward, captivated by the subtle emotions expressed in each chord. Even the millionaire, the man whose wealth and influence could dominate any room, seemed uncharacteristically quiet, focused entirely on the sound filling the hall. His usual air of control had softened, replaced by curiosity and a growing sense of respect. She felt a deep sense of accomplishment with every passing note. Not because she sought recognition, but because she had found her footing in a space that had seemed impossible to navigate. Fear had once threatened to paralyze her, yet through the music, she had transformed it into courage. The piano was no longer just a tool for self-expression. It had become a bridge, a way to communicate feelings too complex for words, too subtle for conversation. The hall, which had felt intimidating and cold, seemed to change with her music. The grand chandeliers, the polished floors, the expensive furniture, they all faded into the background. What mattered now was the connection between the performer and the audience. The silent understanding that music could create bonds where words could not. She felt the warmth of that connection, subtle but powerful. Coursing through the space, with each passing moment, her confidence grew. She began to explore dynamics she had never dared to use in public. Letting the music swell and recede naturally, expressing joy, sorrow, and hope. Every note was deliberate, yet free, guided by instinct and feeling rather than fear. She realized that this was not a test she had to pass, but an opportunity to share a piece of herself with the world. And she embraced it fully. The guests, who had once regarded her with mild amusement or indifference, now seemed genuinely invested in her performance. They were no longer seeing a background staff member pushed into the spotlight. They were witnessing someone sharing her truth. Eyes softened, shoulders relaxed, and even casual glances carried a new weight of attention. The atmosphere was transforming, quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. The energy in the room had shifted from judgment to genuine interest. Her focus remained entirely on the piano, her connection to it, and the music that flowed through her. Every note she played was a conversation with herself, the instrument, and the audience. She realized that her fear had been both her enemy and her ally. It had threatened to stop her, yet it had also sharpened her awareness, making each note more intentional, more meaningful. She was learning to transform anxiety into art, and in doing so, she was beginning to transform the room itself. Time seemed to stretch, yet she did not notice. The world beyond the hall, the evening outside, the events that had led her here, they all disappeared. There was only the music, the piano, and the quiet yet attentive audience. She felt a sense of flow, a harmony between her own emotions, her hands, and the keys beneath her fingers. The connection was real, tangible, and profoundly moving. The millionaire, who had once expected perhaps a polite but forgettable performance, now seemed captivated. His skepticism had vanished, replaced by curiosity and a subtle respect. He leaned slightly forward in his seat, watching her hands move with precision and grace. The room had shifted in tone, becoming more attentive, more alive, more human. Even those who had initially doubted her talent could no longer ignore the emotion and skill in her. Performance. With every chord, she felt more grounded, more confident, more herself. The fear that had once threatened to paralyze her had been replaced by focus, determination, and a quiet joy in sharing her music. She was no longer simply responding to external expectations. She was expressing something deeply personal, something that had been hidden for years. And in doing so, she was changing not only her own experience, but the atmosphere of the room itself. As the music continued, subtle smiles began to appear on faces that had been impassive or skeptical. Eyes glistened, heads tilted in appreciation, and a few guests nodded quietly, moved by the honesty of the performance. The room was no longer just a space for a formal event. It had become a living, breathing audience, connected by the simple but powerful language of music. She felt a quiet pride, not for recognition or applause, but for having faced her fear and found her voice. She had entered the piano with uncertainty and anxiety, but she was beginning to leave it with confidence and grace. The room had responded to her courage. The music had woven a subtle yet powerful transformation throughout the hall. Even as she prepared to continue, she felt the subtle shift in herself. She was no longer simply a background figure, a staff member blending into the margins. She was present, visible, and connected. The audience, through their quiet attentiveness, had acknowledged her presence, her skill, and her courage. The tension had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something productive, inspiring, and deeply human. And in that moment, she understood something essential. Fear could be powerful, but it could also be transformed into strength. Judgment could be heavy, but honesty could lighten it. The room, once full of expectation and doubt, was beginning to recognize not just her skill but the person behind the music. And she knew with quiet certainty that the rest of the evening, and perhaps her life, could never be the same. The room had changed quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, but it had changed. She could feel it in the way the guests held themselves, in the sudden stillness that replaced the polite murmurs and shifting chairs. The tension that had weighed so heavily in the air had begun to lift, replaced by a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and something more profound connection. The music she played was no longer just a series of notes. It had become a voice, a presence that filled the space. With emotion that could not be ignored, her fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence. The notes were no longer tentative. They had grown stronger, richer, more deliberate. She played each phrase with intention, allowing herself to feel the music as deeply as she could. Memories of long nights spent alone at the piano came rushing back. The quiet moments where she had poured her heart into melodies that no one would ever hear. Those same melodies were alive now, resonating through the grand hall, touching every listener in ways she could not have imagined. The Millionaire's gaze remained fixed on her. But now it was different. The amusement and skepticism had faded, replaced by a palpable respect. He leaned slightly forward in his seat, watching her hands with an intensity that made her feel both nervous and empowered. She had expected him to judge her, to dismiss her as someone unworthy of attention. Instead, he was listening, eerily listening, as though the music had the power to speak to him in a way words could not. She realized, even in the midst of her own performance, how rare and profound that moment was. Around the room, subtle changes were happening. Guests who had been chatting softly now leaned in, drawn into the music. Some held their breath at the unexpected beauty of what they were hearing. One man, who had seemed entirely indifferent, now had a faint smile, his eyes following the rise and fall of her hands on the keys. Another guest rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table, as if to steady herself, her gaze fixed on the performer with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. Even the staff, who had been quietly moving through the room, paused to watch, unable to resist the quiet power of the music. She let herself sink deeper into the performance. Every note was intentional, every pause deliberate. She was no longer thinking about the audience or the pressure of the room. She was thinking only about the music and what it allowed her to express. Fear had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into focus, clarity, and an awareness that she had rarely experienced before. She could feel the energy of the room responding to her. A subtle but undeniable presence that pushed her to play with more honesty and depth than ever before. The piece she played now was one she had practiced countless times in solitude, a composition that carried with it years of emotion, struggle, and quiet triumphs. Each chord was a fragment of her story, each melody a reflection of her heart. She let the music speak for her, revealing feelings she had never dared to express aloud. The notes flowed effortlessly, moving from soft whispers to bold declarations, creating a dynamic journey that pulled the audience along with it. For the first time, she noticed the emotional impact her music was having. A few guests had tears in their eyes, subtle but unmistakable. Others sat silently, their expressions softened, as if the music had touched something deep within them that they could not name. She had not intended to move anyone. She had only intended to play, to share a piece of herself honestly. And yet, here was the evidence that music had the power to reach people in ways that words never could. The millionaire shifted in his seat, clearly affected by the depth of the performance. His usual air of control, the aura that seemed to dominate every room he entered, had softened. She could see the subtle change in his posture, the way his eyes followed every motion of her hands. It was as if the music had bypassed his defenses entirely, connecting with something deeper than wealth, influence, or status. In that moment, she realized that what she was doing was bigger than herself. It was a rare and fragile human connection unfolding in real time. As the music continued, she became more aware of her own transformation. She had entered this performance as someone filled with anxiety, doubt, and the desire to remain unseen. Now, she was alive in a way she had never experienced before. The piano was no longer just an instrument, it was a companion, a partner in telling her story. The fear that had threatened to paralyze her was now a quiet rhythm beneath the music. A reminder of the journey she had taken to arrive at this moment. She began to experiment slightly, letting herself be guided by intuition rather than the structure of the composition. The notes grew bolder, the melodies more intricate, and the room responded. There was a subtle shift in the air, a sense of shared understanding between her and the audience. They were no longer passive observers. They were participants, silently acknowledging the emotions woven into each phrase, the vulnerability that had been so carefully hidden until now. A moment came when she paused briefly, letting the last note of a phrase linger in the air. The silence that followed was profound, almost tangible. She could feel it pressing gently against her ears, the collective intake of breath from the room. It was a silence filled with attention, reflection, and unspoken emotion. She realized how rare this moment was, how rarely people truly stop to listen, to feel, to be present with another human being. And in that realization, she found strength. When she resumed playing, the music grew more confident, more expressive. She allowed herself to explore the full range of emotion she had kept hidden for so long. The melodies rose and fell like waves, carrying the audience along a journey they had not expected to take. She could sense them leaning in, their focus unwavering, their hearts and minds drawn into the story she was telling through sound alone. She was no longer just playing for herself. She was sharing a piece of humanity, a connection that transcended words, titles, and appearances. The room, once filled with skepticism and subtle judgment, had become alive with attention. Faces softened, shoulders relaxed, and eyes glistened with emotion. She could feel the collective heartbeat of the audience syncing in a way with her own. The music had created a shared space, a temporary sanctuary, where social status, wealth, and expectation held no power. Here, there was only sound, emotion, the fragile beauty of human connection. She noticed small gestures from the guests' hands clasped lightly, heads tilted, eyes following the rise and fall of her fingers. Even the millionaire, who had seemed untouchable at first, showed signs of being affected. His hands rested lightly on the table, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed intently on her. She realized that the room was no longer observing her performance with detachment or judgment. They were feeling it, experiencing it, and she had become the conduit for that experience. Her confidence continued to grow with each passing moment. She had feared this performance, worried that she would falter under pressure, that the room would dismiss her as unworthy. But those fears had been replaced by focus and clarity. She played not to impress, not to earn recognition, but to express something authentic, to share a part of herself with the world. The audience, in turn, was responding with attention, empathy, and a rare openness that took her by surprise. She began to sense the potential for transformation beyond the music itself. The room had changed because she had dared to be vulnerable. The energy of the space was different, warmer, more attentive, more human. People who had entered the hall with assumptions and judgments were now engaged, listening with hearts open, even if only slightly. She realized that this was the power of honesty, of courage, and of allowing oneself to be fully present in the moment. Her fingers moved over the keys with precision and grace, guided by intuition and emotion rather than fear. Every note was a deliberate choice, a reflection of her inner world, and a bridge to the audience. She could feel the subtle reactions around Hertha, quick inhalation of breath, the faint nods, the glimmers of tears. She understood that music was a universal language, capable of communicating what words often fail to express. And she felt privileged to be the messenger, even in this brief, fragile moment. As the performance progressed, she noticed a subtle unity forming in the room. Guests who had seemed indifferent or skeptical were now leaning in, their attention focused entirely on her and the music. There was a sense of shared experience, a quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful was unfolding. She realized that the fear she had carried into the room was no longer hers. Alone, it had been absorbed, transformed, and shared through the music in a way that connected everyone present. The millionaire shifted in his seat again, this time more noticeably. His usual air of control and authority had softened completely, replaced by attentive curiosity and respect. She could see the subtle change in his expression, the way his eyes followed her hands, the slight relaxation in his posture. It was clear that he was not just hearing the music. He was feeling it, experiencing it alongside the rest of the audience. The performance was no longer a mere formality. It had become a profound human moment, one that transcended wealth, status, and expectation. She allowed herself a brief moment to reflect on how far she had come. From the trembling uncertainty that had gripped her at the start, she had grown into a presence in the room, fully engaged with the music and the audience. The fear remained faintly, like a shadow, but it no longer controlled her. She had transformed it into focus, clarity, and courage, and the room, in turn, had transformed, becoming a space of shared attention, emotion, and connection. As she continued to play, she felt the music carrying her forward, lifting her beyond self-consciousness and doubt. Each phrase was a new opportunity, a new chance to express herself, to connect with the audience, and to create a space where honesty and emotion mattered more than appearances or expectation. She had become fully present, and in doing so, she had brought the room with her. The music swelled and receded, rising with confidence and falling into quiet reflection. She allowed herself to explore the full range of expression she had cultivated in private, every note infused with intention and heart. The audience responded in kind, their focus unwavering, their engagement growing with every passing phrase. It was no longer simply a performance. It was a conversation, a shared journey, a moment of connection that transcended the ordinary. The room had been transformed, though no one could say exactly when the change had begun. What had started as polite curiosity and quiet skepticism had evolved into something entirely different, a sense of connection that could be felt in the air. The guests, who had entered the hall with careful composure, now leaned forward slightly in their seats, their eyes attentive, their expressions softened. The laughter and casual chatter that had filled the corners of the room earlier in the evening were gone, replaced by a shared focus, an unspoken agreement to witness what was unfolding with genuine presence. She felt it immediately, the weight of attention shifting in a way that was both exhilarating and humbling. Her fingers glided over the keys with increasing confidence, each note resonating with emotion and honesty. The music no longer belonged solely to her. It had become something larger, a shared experience between herself and everyone present. She was aware of the subtle movements of the audience, the soft inhalation of breath, the tilt of a head, small shift of hands gripping the edge of a table, and it filled her with quiet reassurance. They were listening. They were fully present. For the first time, she allowed herself to stop worrying about mistakes. The fear that had gripped her at the beginning, the fear of being judged or dismissed, had been replaced by a sense of purpose. Each note, each chord carried a fragment of her story, years of quiet dedication, nights spent alone in practice, moments of doubt and triumph that had shaped her understanding of music and life. She realized that the room was responding not just to her skill, but to the honesty and vulnerability she allowed herself to express. The music had become a bridge between her inner world and the external one. And in that bridge she found her courage. The millionaire, who had at first seemed amused by the situation, was now completely absorbed. His usual air of superiority and control had softened, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes fixed on her hands as they moved across the keys. The small furrow in his brow, which had hinted at doubt earlier, had smoothed out. And there was a subtle acknowledgement in his gaze. He was witnessing something unexpected, something that challenged his assumptions and demanded his attention. She did not play for him or for any audience member. She played for the music itself. And in doing so, she had captured their hearts. The guests around the room were also visibly affected. Some leaned in, their hands resting lightly on the table. Their expressions softened by the unexpected depth of the performance. A woman near the front blinked rapidly, tears glinting in her eyes, while another man at the back of the hall straightened his posture, captivated by the subtle ebb and flow of the music. It was no longer a performance in the traditional sense. It was a shared human experience, a quiet conversation in which no words were needed. The room had become intimate, even in its grandness, and the boundaries between performer and audience had begun to dissolve as she continued to play. She allowed herself to explore the full range of dynamics she had cultivated over years of practice. The music rose and fell, sometimes bold and assertive, sometimes delicate and introspective. She let the notes breathe, allowing each one to resonate fully, carrying the weight of emotion she had kept hidden for so long. Her confidence was no longer tentative. It had grown into something steady and assured, a quiet power that guided the room into a shared emotional space. The hall itself seemed to respond to the music. The chandeliers overhead, which had earlier cast a cold, polished light, now seemed warmer, reflecting the gentle intimacy of the moment. The polished floors and walls absorbed the sound, amplifying it in subtle ways, creating a cocoon of emotion that enveloped everyone present. The atmosphere was no longer formal or distant. It was alive with the resonance of human connection, a testament to the power of honesty and vulnerability expressed through art. She began to notice the small details in the audience's reactions more keenly. A man who had seemed skeptical at the beginning now leaned forward with his chin resting in his hands, eyes glistening as the music washed over him. A woman, her arms crossed at first in a posture of polite detachment, had relaxed, her hands resting gently on her lap as she listened intently. Even the staff, who had been moving quietly through the room earlier, had paused to watch, caught by the emotional pull of the performance. Each subtle movement, each small sign of attention, reinforced her sense that the music was achieving something profound. The millionaire shifted again, more noticeably this time, as if the music had stripped away the barriers he usually maintained. His eyes followed every motion of her hands. His expression softened, and he seemed fully immersed in the experience. He had come expecting a polite, perhaps forgettable performance. Instead, he was witnessing something raw, authentic, and deeply human. She realized that her music had disrupted expectations, challenging assumptions about who she was and what she could do. And in that disruption, she found freedom. The performance continued to build momentum. She allowed herself to take risks, exploring subtle nuances in tempo and expression that she had rarely dared to use in public. The room responded subtly but unmistakably. Guests who had once been distant or skeptical now leaned forward, completely absorbed. There was a shared energy in the space, a quiet electricity that connected everyone through the music. The piano had become more than an instrument. It was a vessel for emotion, a bridge between her inner world and the hearts of those listening. She felt a growing sense of presence, a connection not just to the music, but to the audience and the room itself. The fear that had threatened to paralyze her at the beginning had been transformed into focus, clarity, and quiet strength. Each note she played reinforced her sense of purpose, reminding her of the hours she had spent alone in practice, the struggles she had overcome, and the passion that had driven her to pursue music in the first place. The piano was no longer just a tool for expression. It had become a partner, guiding her through the delicate balance of vulnerability and strength. The audience's engagement deepened as she continued. People were no longer just listening. They were feeling, reflecting, and connecting with the music on a level that transcended words. The room had become a living, breathing entity, shaped by the flow of emotion that moved through her fingers and into the space. The shared experience was subtle but undeniable, a testament to the power of honest expression and the quiet courage it takes to reveal one's true self. She began to play, more dynamically, letting the music rise and fall with greater intensity. The crescendos carried energy and passion, while the softer passages invited reflection and introspection. Each phrase was deliberate, yet free, guided by intuition and emotion rather than fear. The audience responded in kind, their attention unwavering, their expressions reflecting the journey she was taking them on. The room had become a space of shared humanity, where social barriers, wealth, and status no longer mattered.